Hello, I'm just gonna get started because I like talking about mushrooms. So thanks for joining everybody. It's great to see you two and you three actually. I hope you're having a beautiful Saturday, Scorpio new moon, a wonderful wild earth virtual market. So yeah, we have an hour here today with talking about Fungi 101 and spore prints. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Awesome, thank you. Cool. Well, I'll just introduce myself a little bit, then we'll go into who fungi are, what they do ecologically, a little details with particularly in Utah, since that's where this market is based. That's where I'm born and raised in. And then we'll talk about spore prints and how to make them if you've never made them before. They're pretty fun and a great way to get to know mushrooms, as well as an important feature for identification purposes. So my name is Gabriela. I am the founder of Moon Mushrooms, where I really see fungi as more of a language and a perspective, ancestor, teacher, mythology, and science. And I'm part of Wild Earth Virtual Market November 2020. I have my triple extract mushroom tinctures available online, and I'm super excited to be restocking these for the winter time. I hand grow with lots of love my mushrooms, very tiny batch. So I've been studying fungi for a little bit over 7 years, and I learned a lot about them in Seattle. Around Seattle is where I lived and went to school, and now I have returned about a year ago to the Wasatch Mountains. So it's been a really fun time learning more about the local fungi here. So I really like being outside to the right here. I guide mushroom walks. I write mycoastrology, which really rides the languages between astrology and mushrooms. And I just do a lot of educative things with mushrooms. So I just really like this picture because I like inviting that, fungi, of course, are living beings and they have incredibly animated, complex histories and lifestyles and behaviors and personalities in and of themselves. And we and me and you are so gratefully on this planet, and we get to learn from these incredible organisms who really do a lot for our planet. So for a very long time, we haven't really learned about them in our common culture. So I really value mycological education in a way that can bring fungi to the foreground. And I think that fungi not only benefit us scientifically, but socially, culturally, really thinking about what it's like to live with fungi, to see fungi as not only organisms, but teachers, very ancient teachers, actually. So mycology is the study of fungi. It comes from the Greek word mykes, M-Y-K-E-S. And if you're going outside and getting to know your mushrooms, you might have to wait here, at least in the Wasatch Mountains, for mushroom season, which really isn't when there's snow out, unfortunately. So, as we venture into the darkness, into the winter time, we can get to know mushrooms through cultivation, through storytelling, through sharing knowledge and experience with one another. But if you're outside at some point in your life where there has been previous rainfall, maybe some fog or humidity, usually in the springtime or the fall time, depending on where you're at, or even sometimes all year round, there will be mushrooms. And, oftentimes you can smell mushrooms before you even see them. They really invite us to inhabit our bodies and our senses while we're walking, or even much more of a crawl in the forest. I like to joke that I don't give mushroom walks, I give mushroom crawls because, like this picture says, mycologist hiking club, we might not get there. We're really just crawling around on our hands and knees and not covering a very large area. So we'll go over just kind of basics of fungi, who fungi are, very foundational material. So this image I really like showing because the top circle shows how many species of animals you might think there are. And the bottom circle shows how many species of fungi we think there are. So the top circle, if we see animals, the gray circle shows how many species might be there that scientists and we think might exist. And then the green circle on the inside shows how many species we have described of animals. So we can see that there's a really big margin, right, of so many animals that we have not described or identified yet. About 2 to 11 million species of animals have not been identified to our best estimate. And then we go down here to the circle on the bottom and we see fungi have an even smaller green circle. We've only described about 120,000 species so far. This is a little bit of an old image, but we see that the margin of the green circle compared to the outside of the gray circle is so much bigger. So we really have very little understanding of the mushroom species that could be out there. The best estimate is somewhere between 2 to 5 million species of mushrooms that might exist. And since we've only identified about 120,000 of them, we've probably only identified really about 6%, which is not very much at all. And then at the bottom here, we can see the last circle is for plants. And the green circle is actually really big in comparison to the gray circle. There's just a little margin if we see at the bottom of that circle down there. And that's because we have actually identified quite a lot of plants, mostly because plants don't actually move, right? So if we see a bush and we come up to this bush in the wintertime, it might be hard to identify, but we can come back to the same place in the spring or the summer and maybe see its blossoms or its buds, and we can identify this plant and revisit it periodically throughout the year. So plants have received a lot of attention this way, whereas fungi have been so cryptically living. I really understand them as the archetypal inhabitants of realms above and below. They spend a lot of their time actually underground and within the ground, and even within roots and within plants, within leaves. And they really only fruit as a mushroom when certain ecological timings are just right. And that usually includes an increase in precipitation and a decrease in humidity. And further, mushrooms might only exist and fruit above ground and be visual for us humans for anywhere from, maybe a few months to usually like a week or maybe even only a couple of hours. So each encounter with a mushroom is very beautiful and important. And I encourage each of you to know that every time you encounter a mushroom, that's a very special interaction. And if you're interested in fungi, I encourage you to, I will have a long list of resources at the end of this presentation, but I encourage you to further study with your local Mushroom Society of Utah chapter. They do a lot of foraging, and to possibly even keep your own collection of mushrooms, because there's a whole genetic revolution happening where a mushroom that we thought was the same species as one that was growing in Italy, let's say, is actually a very different species genetically, even though they look very similar. So there's a huge revolution happening with genetics and with identification. There's also a really big, many people are really tuning into the fact that fungi are very closely related to animals and to humans genetically on the topic of genetics. And I think this is really cool because a lot of people have really become really interested in this topic. I think it's a wonderful thing for people to realize the similarities and the teachings and the wisdom that are in the earth. And me, I study fungi, so I just that's who I look to for wisdom and love. But I really like to flesh out this idea just a little bit more. So this is a general genetic tree showing at the very bottom what was at one point a universal ancestor, probably, we think. And along the way, different, different sections of life started splitting off from this tree. And we see that, so we have prokaryotes, which are simple cells, and then eventually eukaryotes, which are multicellular, more complex cells splitting off down the way. Then we have plants splitting off. Then we have fungi splitting off. And then finally animals and humans splitting off. So essentially, our cells were the same as fungi once we split off from plants. We were very genetically similar. Plants split off far before animals split off from fungi. So I think that's a really cool thing. We have so many similarities. Fungi, though, are what we call, they digest, they live to digest, basically, which is really fascinating. So a lot of their digestion is very different from ours, though. We usually absorb our food first and then digest in our stomach. And then fungi, though, digest first and then absorb into their mycelium, which is what we're about to discuss. So many of us might have known or heard or seen some mycelium in your garden patch when you're out in your soil. These little white threads that permeate really 90% of all terrestrial habitat, of all terrestrial life on this earth. So I've been talking about fungi, and when I talk about fungi, I'm really talking about two things. Fungi, the fungus is an organism, talks about a mushroom, which we see at the top here, as well as mycelium. So a fungus is usually mycelium actually, and like I mentioned before, might not really ever even fruit a mushroom. A lot of species don't actually fruit mushrooms. Fruiting mushrooms is a genetic adaptation, actually. So for hundreds of thousands of years, fungi actually didn't even fruit mushrooms. So we have these two facets of this organism: the mushroom up top here, and the mycelial web in the ground below and inside. So mycelium is really a network of transportation tubes. They're really thin strands, about a fifth of the width of a piece of human hair, and they exist as a transportation network. And so a lot of people might say that mushrooms don't move, right? They're organisms that remain in one place. And I think this is a really interesting question because mycelium as their lifestyle exists as transportation. So it's a really interesting question to think about. And then we also have the fact that mushrooms fruit up and down, right? So they actually move earth oftentimes and move up and then decompose back down. So it's interesting to think about movement. But anyway, so essentially, when we think of the life cycle of a fungus, we have these strands of mycelium. Each individual strand is called a hyphae, one hyphae, and these hyphae will branch and fuse, and each species basically has their own network. And when two hyphae or two networks of mycelium meet each other, they will release pheromones, they'll start fusing with one another, and if they're genetically compatible, which is not sexually, it's not genderly compatible at all. Fungi have hundreds and thousands of sexual mating types sometimes, so it has nothing to do with gender. But if they are genetically compatible to a certain degree, their mycelium will merge somehow and basically form a knot, and then out of the knot, a mushroom will fruit. What I find really fascinating is that the cellular structure of a piece of hyphae, or the mycelium, is actually the same exact cell as a mushroom, which is a very unique thing on Earth because if you think of like an apple tree, the cell of the root is going to be different from the cell of an apple. So what's happening with mushrooms is basically their cells are transforming the whole time. They're just kind of literally just transforming into new shapes and structures, and perhaps, you know, acquiring different attributes to the mycelial cell. But it's really cool how they transform so well. Um, so here's just a little image of mycelium. Um, to the left, I have a little jar. Oh, I have some with me actually right here, so I can show you. This is what it's like to grow mushrooms at home. You just have jars of mycelium everywhere. This is on rye berries, which is a very typical um, spawn to use. So it kind of depends on how fast or slow the mycelium grows. Most mycelium grows radially, so just, you know, centrally outward. You can see in these pictures. The growth rate will change depending on moisture, humidity, temperature. So we have kind of this understanding of mycelium, which exists as a transport network, right? Transporting water, antibiotics, nutrients like zinc and phosphorus, all around our ecosystems. Our bioregions and our ecosystems in general would not exist without fungi. So this network of mycelium is really doing most of that work. So what is a mushroom then? So many different mushrooms on the screen. It's so wonderful to look at. Scientists have kind of thought that mushrooms are, for a while, for the past few decades, that mushrooms exist solely for reproduction purposes. But, you know, a lot of mycologists really are skeptical as to, like, you know, it's really just for reproduction purposes. Because, you know, why then would they have all these different colors and shapes and smells and tastes? Why are some of them poisonous? Why are some of them edible to humans? There are so many different toxins. What are psychoactive compounds, medicinal compounds doing in mushrooms, right? So it's a really good question to not, I think, take at face value as to why mushrooms exist. But essentially, in many ways, the mushroom represents, to me, I think, a fungus in many different ways, and are a variety of small, tiny, little, minute, actually like microscopically sized mushrooms sometimes, to huge, like enveloping mushrooms that have evolved a huge variety of forms, odors, textures, as well as spore release and production. So spores are another really important facet of today's discussion because we're talking about spore prints. So all these mushrooms produce spores in different ways. Up here, if you see this bird's nest fungi, these are actually little packets of spores called corygioles. And those packets actually they get flushed out of the cup, these tiny little cups that are like the size of like a quarter of my fingernail probably. And the packets get pushed out when raindrops or water fall into the cups. And that's a spore release mechanism. Over here to the right, we have a kind of a stinkhorn, which is the red star-colored mushroom. And you can actually see like some brown goop on it that looks like mud. And that's actually called the gleba. That's actually where the spores are. The spores are like this sticky, globular, like mucus, essentially, that covers the mushroom and then gets carried by insects, usually flies, are attracted to the scent of this. It smells really gnarly usually in these stinkhorns. And then that's how the spores get spread, are through bugs. You know, all these different mushrooms have different reproduction methods. This one right here is a cordyceps that we'll talk about briefly. So you might have heard about cordyceps mushrooms. This is a type of entomopathogenic mushroom, meaning that the fungus will actually kill a live insect and then fruit out of the body. So many different kinds of spore release, and the spores will just get right into, but I really like seeing if any of you have questions at all, because I really like for this to be a mycelial community. So if any of you have questions right now, please feel free to unmute yourself or type anything in the chat.
Do you have a favorite mushroom?
Ooh, gosh, this question is just like always gets me because it's like, do you have a favorite kid? Well, um, okay, well, it like basically changes every few weeks for me. I really liked reishi, Ganoderma lucidum complex, for the past few months because I was experimenting with growing that mushroom for the past year, and that's a mushroom that I really work with a lot in my tinctures. And it was so fun watching this mushroom grow, like having that intimate experience with the mushroom, because reishi grows very slowly, first of all. And so it's a very atypical process for me because usually, you like see a mushroom and you collect it quickly and you observe it and then you watch it decompose quickly. But the growth of the reishi, the first time I grew a reishi like block, essentially mycelium, it grew up like a really big foot. It just looked like a big foot. I thought that was like a really interesting experience. And then I just got back actually from having a wonderful mushrooming experience in the Pacific Northwest for the past like 4 or 5 weeks. And I really had a good time with lactarius mushrooms. Lactarius are really cool mushrooms where if you cut, they're just a typical kind of cap stem mushroom, and they look a lot like rucolas. But if you actually cut the gills of the lactarius mushroom, it'll bleed a latex, like little like dollops of liquid latex that usually are milky like. They're thick and they look like milk. They might be red or they might be clear, will form. And those are just so cool to me. It's like, why do they have liquid latex like that? So that's a recent favorite fascination. Anybody else have any other questions?
Yeah, I had a question. So I've been trying to forage mushrooms in the Wasatch, and obviously that's not really working out because it's been dry. I found some puffballs in the Uintas in the spring. I'm wondering if you've had success foraging in the Wasatch or if you usually go to the Northwest.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, so if you're interested in foraging as a group, potentially depending on the health environment, I'd recommend you signing up on the email Cilium that I have if you're all interested. There's also the Utah Mycological Society, which does a lot of foraging as well. But I'm really interested in kind of shifting what I've been doing in the Pacific Northwest to the Wasatch Mountains because this is where I'm based now. And I do a lot of like seasonal foraging and seasonal observance with honoring fungi, as well as foraging with them within the forest. And yeah, of course, it's not as abundant as the Pacific Northwest is in many ways, but partly what I'm about to get to is there's so many different fungi within our ecosystems that are just unseen, but they don't really produce mushrooms, right? But if we're looking at, having a good time trying to eat some mushrooms that we find, most of my foraging is in the Uintas. When a rain comes, go here, possibly even like a day after the rain, or up to like a week maybe after the rain. Rains are just really essential for the mushrooms here for sure. But I've definitely found some edibles and some medicinals here. It just is a little bit more of an adventure usually. Let's see, let me look at the chat. You welcome people into your space and showing hands on your mushroom, mycelium, and your process of making tinctures. What benefits have you seen taking mushrooms? It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I really exist on this earth in many ways to share the love and the wisdom of the mushrooms. So of course, I welcome people into my space with making tincture processes. Unfortunately, this talk just doesn't have the bandwidth for that because that would take another hour probably to accurately explain my tincture making processes. But I've offered many different online courses, especially in this time. I've done a lot of in-person workshops and in-person walks, but yeah, maybe, sometime in December, I could probably offer an online tincture making class because just making a double or triple extract tincture is not as hard as it seems. And you could do a lot of research and observation on the particular temperatures and like quantities and stuff, but it's really, 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 really actually very simple because most of the tincture making has been much more of a folk thing. So I'd be happy to share how to make triple extract tinctures. You'll find out, once again, if you find my email Celia, most likely, that newsletter. I'm really not a big fan of social media, so the email Cilium is a really good way to keep in touch with my offerings. And then I also have a list of resources at the end too that have a few other local people. So before we get into spore prints and how to make them, I do want to mention the 4 main fungal lifestyles, because many species actually exist kind of flirting in between these lifestyles. So a mushroom might exist being a saprophytic mushroom over here, or a saprotrophic, which I'll just explain in a moment, but might also exist as being a mycorrhizal mushroom sometimes, which is a very curious thing that mycologists really weren't very aware of for quite a long time. So saprotrophic mushrooms are the Death Eaters. That's what that word literally means, saprotrophism. So these are the mushrooms responsible for 90% of all decomposition on Earth. We would be walking around in debris like everywhere if it weren't for fungi. I mean, we wouldn't be able to exist in many ways. Many of these mushrooms are the ones that are the easiest to cultivate, like oyster mushrooms. Many of them are also the medicinal mushrooms. Many of them are, although medicinal mushrooms really fall into each of these categories. Some of the conchs that we have up here in Utah are saprobes. Oyster mushrooms also grow in Utah. So the next group of fungal lifestyles are the parasitic mushrooms. And these are also referred to as the pathogenic, the pathogens. This group has really given mushrooms a bad rap because they've been responsible for blights and, contributing to the Dust Bowl and things like that, like having this really beneficial microbial network that's essential for a lot of agricultural practices and the regeneration of Earth. The fungi in this way of being parasites or pathogens will actually act as what's called vocal fungi, and they'll really tip off as to where an imbalance is in our ecosystem. So in many ways, humans have been like, oh, there's this really big fungal pathogen happening on this monocropic, like agricultural, just fields of the same species, right? Like, well, if you're gonna have hundreds of acres of the same species planted in a monolithic cropping style of it, then fungi are gonna tell you that's a problem and create some kind of a pathogenic response. So in many ways, parasites, in many ways, are kind of engineers of long-term ecosystem health, and it's pretty easy for humans to think more in the short-term perspective. One interesting local parasitic phenomenon is the mountain pine beetle, the indigenous mountain pine beetle. You've probably heard of it. It's like a huge western Rocky Mountain regional beetle that's responsible for quite a lot of tree death. And this beetle actually carries the blue stain fungus in its mouth, and it propagates a blue stain fungus. And the relationship between the blue stain fungus and the pine beetle is actually symbiotic. So the pine beetle really exists and is reliant on the fungus, or else the beetle wouldn't be able to lay its eggs and get into the tree because the fungus kind of breaks down the tree's defense system. So there's a really interesting play going on there. But the thing is that with the past 10 to 15 years, the environment has become a lot, essentially the cold spurts that would come throughout the winter aren't really happening anymore. And so that would have killed off the beetle a few times throughout the year, but now the beetles die off isn't happening as persistent. So now we're seeing a lot of trees die. So interesting relationship to look into. Endophytes are our third fungal lifestyle. Endophytes are the really incredible mushrooms, well, not mushrooms, pardon me, fungi that we really don't see that are plants' immune systems. There has never been a study in the Earth's knowledge in our modern scientific understanding that has studied a plant and that has not found a fungal endophyte within the plant, whether it be a tree root or a leaf or a flower or a fruit or a cactus. These endophytic fungi exist inside. There are various different kinds and just kinds of endophytes, but essentially they all exist within plant material. And these endophytes are really essential for the plant's survival. Endophytes are the plant's immune system, bluntly. This is like what make cacti able to exist in Utah with like months of no rainfall. And, you know, cacti have been like incredible. Yeah, they can contain a lot of water, but there's a lot of symbiotic processes happening with the endophytes within the cactus plant that make them able to retain the water that they do and the nutrients and whatnot. So endophytes increase productivity, succession, root and shoot biomass, even the ability to persist through heat and drought and lots of changing climatic movements that we're seeing. Much more disease resistant, much more able to fight off diseases and predators. And then they'll also kind of tell plants when to bloom and communicate with like plant systems in such an interesting way. And then our last fungus lifestyle are the mycorrhizal fungi. And this here we have a local, this is a Utah mushroom right here. So this is actually a porcini mushroom, a Boletus edulis, and this is a really kind of shining star as a symbol of mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi, mostly fruit mushrooms. If you're looking for edible mushrooms, they're mostly, not always, because we have some saprobes and parasites, I guess, that you can eat. But they're mostly going to be mycorrhizal fungi if you're looking for chanterelles, morels, boletes, many, many mushrooms. So mycorrhiza means fungus root. And that's really what this relationship is. It's not a root fungus, it's a fungus root. Fungi are very responsible for maintaining this relationship, basically this underground network that is referred to as the wood wide web sometimes, or the common mycelial network that connects trees and plants and ecosystems. So we have the fungus root association here depicted, and essentially what that's doing is the trees are harnessing carbohydrates from the sun going through photosynthesis, right? And then through the underground networks are giving those carbohydrates or sugars to the fungi, to the mycelium, and then the mycelium trades back and gives the tree roots water, mineral, nutrients, antibiotics, plasma, like micronutrients, many, many things. And then this network can fruit mushrooms. 60% of the sugars that trees make are given to mycelium, which is a lot. That's like more than half of the sugar the trees create are given to fungi. That's a really kind of recent understanding that mycologists and just scientists and people have really found out. And then about 20 to 30% of the energy that the tree creates is given to the mycelium as well. So that's a really strong bond. These are just images of what a tree root looks like. The top two images are tree roots with mycelial sheaths on top, or otherwise known as mantles. They're just two different fungal species, so they have different looking mycelial sheaths. And then the bottom two tree roots don't have any sheaths on them. So this is what roots, really healthy roots, look like. They're covered in mycelium, and it's wonderful. And you know, this mycelium will have a relationship to varying degrees with the root. Sometimes, depending on the type of mycorrhizal relationship, the fungus root, the mycelium will actually penetrate the root to a greater depth, or maybe they'll kind of give a soft hug on the outside instead. There's various different kind of levels of mycorrhizal relationships. So what I was describing before is this common mycorrhizal network, otherwise referred to as the Wood Wide Web. And when you're looking for mushrooms to eat, you often go to the trees that host these organisms, these mushrooms. And in Utah, I put a list right here of many of the trees that grow that host local mushroom species. I mean, essentially, it's whatever the fir, spruce, pine, cottonwoods are going to be in your area. So here there's a lot of white fir, there's a lot of Engelmann spruce, blue spruce, Douglas fir. So when you're looking for mushrooms, it's really important to know the habitats and the forests that you're looking in and the kind of tree you're looking at too. Some trees and plants can't actually grow without mycelium to access the distant or non-soluble nutrients like pines, melons, oaks, citrus, and grapes. So some local mushrooms include this Boletus edulis, which has a really great stem reticulation. It has kind of like veiny textures on the stem. These mushrooms are really fun to find. So if you're able to find them here in winter areas, or just, it's a mushroom that grows as a mycorrhizal association to pine, spruce, hemlock, and fir. These are great edibles. Porcini means little pig. They're also known as penny buns because they kind of look like big loaves of bread, just like popping through the forest floor. I will also mention that this mushroom has pores underneath it, right? So this mushroom doesn't have gills that we usually think of with mushrooms, but it has pores. And though you can still take spore prints, most of the time with pored mushrooms as well. Spores as in like kind of like our own skin pores. A few other kind of more common, I guess, Utah species do include this puffball, which somebody had mentioned before about finding these around, which these seem to be pretty common here. They're common in kind of like suburban areas where there's a lot of grass. They are saprobic mushrooms, so they are decomposing, that they're death eaters. And they think they're mostly decomposing like grass material, so that you can usually find them in fields. And these mushrooms can get really, really big. I've never still found a puffball that's been like larger than this. This is like maybe the largest puffball I've seen, which is pretty big, but like they can get huge. It's usually on the East Coast too. Mushrooms will grow larger when there's more water or rainfall, because mushrooms are 90% water anyway. So if you find a puffball like one of these mushrooms, they're mostly edible. This species in particular, Calvadia gigantea, is edible. Of course, this brings me to the very important point that you always must know absolutely 100% the mushroom that you're identifying in order to ingest and eat, because there are mushroom poisonings that happen. And just always know absolutely what the mushroom is. Don't take a chance. Don't be risky. People get sick and die. So this puffball to the right here, you can see has actually a spore mass, spores on the inside of the mushroom. And when the mushroom is young, the inside of the mushroom is white because the spores haven't matured yet. But then when the mushroom ages, on this bottom right picture here, you can kind of see there's like a tear in the mushroom. So you can see this like caramely colored spore gook that is within the mushroom. And this is what's called a gleba. So this is like the spore mass. And once the mushroom has a gleba and is brown on the inside, once puffballs are brown on the inside, you don't want to eat them. It's just, I don't think it would necessarily, some people might have bad reactions to glebas and spore masses, honestly. And every person has their own allergic reactions to mushrooms. If you're a more sensitive person to mold and allergies, food allergies, each person has their own just guidelines basically with what they can and cannot eat. And so even if you've eaten a lot of wild mushrooms, but this is your first time finding a chanterelle, just take a little nibble and wait a half hour, because your body very frankly might not be able to handle chanterelle mushrooms in your digestive system, even though it's edible for most people. That's very much how mushrooms work. And then to the left here is another example of knowing absolutely what you're eating, because this is a mushroom that grows here in the Uintas. It's an example of a group of mushrooms referred to as the false morels. There are true morels, which are morels, dog, smelling the door. He's really loud back there. But there are true morels, which actually have to be cooked to render digestible anyway. So there are definitely mushrooms that you have to actually cook to eat. And this is an example of one of those mushrooms that you should cook before you eat, even though it's not a true morel, it's a false morel. And there's just a yellow band around it because cooking before you eat is a really good guideline. Another kind of mushroom that grows up here in the montane environments, a group of mushrooms are referred to as snowbank mushrooms, which are actually pretty unique because, you know, montane environments can be pretty unique, much like islands. And so this is a species of snowbank mushroom called Clitosobe alberiza, meaning, I think, like, it's referring to the white rhizomorphs that are, you can see this mushroom has really thick mycelial mats, and these are referred to as rhizomorphs. So this mushroom actually starts, well, the network is always going to be there, you know, essentially. Maybe the network goes dormant when the temperatures get too cold, but this mushroom will fruit while snowbanks and while snow is melting. And sometimes the mushroom might even fruit while there's still a snowbank on top of it. But different mushrooms like this will fruit around, you know, maybe just a few days after a snowbank has melted, kind of a thing, springtime. And then, you know, a lot of mushrooms aren't just, we don't actually just love mushrooms for their edibility, right? A lot of people do, and that's wonderful. But a lot of mushrooms are also medicinal and, you know, have incredible ecological benefit and whatnot. And this is a type of mushroom that you see basically across the Northern Hemisphere. And here its species name is Fomitopsis mountziae. The species across the world can also be Fomitopsis pinicola, growing on pine trees. But here, this red-belted conch is basically the common name, which can be pretty helpful. And you can find these on down logs. And essentially, this fungus is a type of brown rot or a saprotrophic mushroom. So it's a death eater, and being a brown rot means that this fungus is actually decaying the cellulose of the plant or the tree and then leaving behind the plant lignin. Oftentimes, these mushrooms can be brown as well. Turkey tail is another example of brown rot, even though there's white and brown on it, so it doesn't ring true all the time. But when you see these mushrooms outside, which are a little more common in Utah to see these ones, you can tell your friends, hey, that's a red-belted conch, Fomitopsis mountziae, who's actually named after a lady mycologist, and she thought that this particular species was a unique species, like in the early 1900s, and nobody believed her. They just kept calling it Fomitopsis pinicola. And then, like, I think 5 years ago, they were like, oh, this is actually a different species, and she's right, so we're going to name it after her 100 years later. So Fomitopsis mountziae, it's a brown rot fungi decaying the cellulose but leaving behind the lignin, which is an essential component to wood. So when you're looking for mushrooms, it's a really good idea to be prepared, not only with mushroom supplies, but with mountain supplies, with food, water, backpacks, compass, whistle, maps, know where you're going, bright colored clothing, especially if you're going out and mushrooming during a hunting season. But essentially, this is a very old picture, as you can tell. So you always gotta have a knife, right? Because you're gonna be going deep down into the ground to kind of lift up the mushroom. And a lot of the identification places of the mushroom actually involve the base of the stem. So it's really important to get the full mushroom. So you need your mushroom knife, maybe a mushroom brush if you want to brush off your edible mushrooms in the field. Tackle boxes are one of my most favorite foraging tools because you can place the tiny mushrooms in the tackle boxes and they'll remain intact. Camera documenting the habitat. If you want to really identify what the species is, it comes down to the tree it's growing underneath, or if it's growing off of wood or the ground, things like that. And then also, don't put your mushrooms in plastic bags. They will sweat themselves to death and you won't be able to eat them or appreciate them. Put them in paper bags if you want to collect them separately, or you can put them in a basket, which is why we use baskets so that the spores can actually continue to be dropped as we're carrying the basket throughout the forest, or other kind of mesh material. You can use like sandwich small paper bags. Reynolds wrap's a big no. You do not want to use tinfoil. Tinfoil will bruise and scratch your mushrooms, and that's the only thing that I should like black out in this photo. But that's essentially just the tips to get you started with finding your mushroom so you can then create your spore print. So spores come from the Greek word spora, which can mean seed or sowing. So spores really contain the genetic material of fungi. And when a fungus matures and fruits a mushroom, and then the mushroom matures and then releases spores, the spores are then mature to a certain degree and then fall out and must land somewhere where the environment is nourishing for the spore survival, and then the spore can germinate and create a primary mycelial network that then has to meet a secondary mycelial network most of the time, and then they will do their mycelial sex thing and then form maybe a different network or a different mushroom. Mycelial reproduction is very, very, very fast. But essentially, there are many different kinds of beautiful spores. We can see this image right here shows just a handful of spore morphology. And so the spores are going to come out of the hymenium. The hymenium is the place on the mushroom that is the fertile layer. So it can either be inside of a puffball, or it can be like that sticky glebe mass on the stinkhorns, or on a gilled mushroom, it'll be in the gills at the bottom. This is an example of a conch mushroom, right? Like the Fulmes mountsiae. So the hymenium on these conchs that grow on trees is always the porous underside, right? That's where the spores are going to come out. And spores need humidity to be able to travel. So this is an example of your typical cap and stem mushroom, where we have blades of individual gills, and on each blade are spores. These are particularly called basidiospores. Fungi differ in many ways based off of their spore creation and what kind of spores they have. So there's like ascospores, zygospores, basidiospores. Most cap and stem mushrooms are going to have basidiospores and be what's called basidiomycetes. But so these spores are going to mature with humidity and then be released. And then what we're doing when we make our spore prints is basically capturing the spores as they fall. And fungal spores are always in the air that we breathe, right? They're like even indoors here, they're going to be everywhere. So let's just take a big fungal spore breath all together. Fungi produce about 50 megatons of spores each year across the world, which is about the weight of 500,000 blue whales. And the spores, fungal spores, are actually the largest source of living particles in our air. And fungal spores, to a pretty good degree, actually participate in weather patterns and cloud formation. Spores are pretty cool. So how to make a spore print, if you want to kind of look at, it's pretty cool to look at the different colors. There are many different colors of spores. You find a mushroom. You don't want a young mushroom because the spores haven't matured, and you don't want a really mature mushroom that's already lost most of its spores. You'll probably be able to tell when you're in the field. there might even be multiple specimens, and you can tell, oh, this one looks like a good mature mushroom that has just matured its spores but hasn't released them yet, so I'm going to take it home, make a spore print. Spore prints are also really beneficial for identifying mushrooms. A lot of mushrooms are categorized based off spore prints, like amanitas have their particular category because they grow out of an egg in many ways, but all amanitas also have white spores. Brucellas also have white spores. It can make a difference with what your mushroom is with the spore color. So like I mentioned, making spore prints of these mushrooms is not going to be very easy. Your paper is going to get like really wet if you try to put that left mushroom, the star anemone stinkhorn, on it, and then on the right, basically making a spore print. Could be pretty fun and experimental if you wanted to like crack open the mushroom and then like finger paint with the spore print with the spores or something. There's a whole different experimental realm. So cap and stem mushroom, even if it has foliage or even if it has pores underneath like foliage do, that'll still work, and they actually make little dots of spore prints, which are really fun. So this is a great example of a good mushroom to do a spore print with. This is called an Agaricus sylvicola, which was in the Uinta Mountains this spring. And the gill color to this mushroom is white, and then it'll start to turn pink and then chocolate brown as the spores continue to mature. So you can watch your mushrooms change in really fascinating ways like that. You can see that the gills are pink. So, the spores are starting to mature. They might actually continue to mature even though I picked the mushroom. Certain parts of mushrooms continue to mature. So take it home, try to not damage it as best as you can. And the spore print color of this mushroom should be chocolate brown. I didn't do it, so I don't have it to show you, but I know that it is this mushroom. So you find the mushroom, bring it home. It's really difficult to do a spore print when you have to move the mushroom. So really, find a good place where you can keep it for a few hours to even a day or two. So find a mushroom. You can even do this with like portobellos from the grocery store if you really wanted to. It could be a cool experiment for kids. So you can cut or pinch the stem off because the stem is really in the way at this point because you want a nice flat surface. There are some people who cut holes in paper and then stick the whole mushroom in the hole. I've never done that because it doesn't seem like it works very well, mostly because many of the mushrooms I've been with would be like very heavy and would break the paper, would get the paper wet. I just feel like that wouldn't work for me very well. You can try that too though. But essentially pinching the stem works best for me, or cut the stem off and then place the cap on a piece of paper. I never have like dark paper with me. It's something that I should like put in my repertoire because a lot of the spores are going to be white or light colored and they actually look very cool when they're on black paper or dark purple or gray paper or something. So you can also experiment by putting the cap on like half white, half black paper, and you can see how the spore color varies. So place the cap on a piece of paper or 2 or 3. Most of the time you want to cover the cap with a bowl, is step 4. This is because the spores will not really, essentially the bowl is covering from any competing air currents. So you want the spores to just fall straight down. If the spores start to like slide, it's still pretty cool looking to me too. It kind of depends on the environment you're in and how mature or dry or wet your mushroom is, but you want to let your mushroom sit for at least like 3 or 4 hours. It's usually a good 24 hours. Just let it sit and do its thing for 24, maybe even 36 hours if you're like really not getting any spores and you really just want to keep trying. But even, when you have times where you don't have very much in your camping car, you find a way to make a spore print like on this paper bag and then like an empty food container. So, they can be pretty fun to do. And like I said, many different colors. And, a lot of people make really fun art with this. It's great for identification purposes. It's super cool for kids to experience and for adults kids of all ages to experience. And an optional thing that I haven't looked super a lot into because I just haven't yet. People often ask about a way to like secure the spore print on the paper, right? So it doesn't, you can see here, like there's a finger mark right here that somebody touched and the spore print got picked up, right? So a lot of people are wanting to secure the spore print to the paper. I have tried it with hairspray before, just, holding it from a long distance. Hairspray has a lot of bad things in it though, so I haven't researched any more like spray adhesives, but I'm sure that they're out there that people use. And this is an example of 2 different colors of paper with white spores and dark spores, and how that's a cool thing to be able to look at. And once again, there are many different kinds of spores, many spore colors. Some are green, purple, orange, white, kind of a chocolate, and black. So I'm just going to skip that one. But thank you all for learning about fungi. We have just a minute left if anybody has any final comments or questions, and please continue supporting the virtual market. The Wild Earth Market has plenty of really fascinating craftspeople who are local, so it's a wonderful and political thing to be able to support your local craftspeople. So if you're interested in mushroom medicine, send me a message, sign up for the email Cilium, and get your mushroom tinctures. You are welcome. Yeah, I'll be here for another couple minutes if anybody has any other questions. Oh yeah, and the resources I have for you are all right here. This is a good local Utah mushroom book. Don Johnston is a local mycologist, and you can find him on Facebook. And he has a mushroom binder that he has written for his observations, which is pretty helpful too. These are all great things. iNaturalist, I recommend a lot. Michael Webb, these books down here, Entangled Life and Mushrooms Demystified, really cool things. You're so welcome. Yeah, so if anybody has any questions or comments, we'll have another 30 seconds.
Thank you so much. This was really, really lovely. Thank you.
You're so welcome. Yeah. Mushrooms. I'm so happy that I could be a part of the workshops today. Yeah. Well, everybody, you're so welcome. Yeah, jot down these resources. If you're interested in Utah mycoculture, join my email Cilium online, and yeah, I'm teaching lots of classes, more and more and more online. Probably in the new year, 2021. So if anybody wants to really get further into mycology, I teach 4-week classes, all sorts of things. So thank you all. Have a beautiful Scorpio new moon and Wild Earth Market. Thank you all for supporting local craftspeople. Yep. Yeah, Mushrooms of Utah on Facebook works. All right, bye.